You could also say that an object's existence doesn't need to be explained, but this violates the principle of sufficient reason, or
So here we have PSR. As I told you, this is where he was going right away. PSR, contingent things, natural causal chains can't explain the beginning of the causal chain. One reason that this is a terrible argument is that a series of natural causal chains does not ever get you to a supernatural beginning. In other words, there is no basis to make that leap unless you're a Christian and a believer, right? So yeah, it does make sense if you're a Christian to believe that there's no infinite causal chain. But half of these Thomists are literally using arguments predicated on an infinite causal chain, because Aristotle says that the first actualizer has to always actualize something. What did he always eternally actualize? Prima materia, right? Prime matter, which is pure potentia, right? So God needs pure potentia other than himself in the Aristotelian scheme, you see.
PSR, which says things have a reason for why they exist.
Now, what's another way that we can critique this argument? So remember, this argument begins with, well, we all know there's a principle of sufficient reason, and the principle of sufficient reason says things need an explanation of why or how they exist. So the principle of sufficient reason is now taking the place, or it's being imported into the causal chain, causal argument, first cause argument. But we are dealing with people who don't believe anymore in causation. Now you can say, well, that's a self-own. Yeah, it is. But once you start admitting that it's circular and it's a self-own, or it's a self-contradiction, now you're venturing into the domain of transcendental arguments, right? That's what we say, right? We say that's exactly right. You know, you can't use logic and deny logic, right? But that's a different thing than explaining how do we know the principle of sufficient reason is the case? How do we know that the causal chain or the causation is actually operant in the world as a external objective phenomenon? Now, if you follow Hume's argument, Hume says that you can't if you have the peripatetic axiom as your basis. If you believe that nothing is in the intellect that's not first in the senses, where in pure sense data do you have causation? I'm not talking about event A and event B, but causation itself. You don't, obviously. And nobody who believes in this pure sense data, simplistic classic medieval theory could even begin to answer that, right? Now, again, the only response is they'll say, well, if you don't believe in causation, it reduces to absurdity. Yes, that's correct. We would agree with that, right? But that's why that moves us in the direction of transcendental arguments. If you're going to use transcendental arguments for those kinds of categories, why not use the transcendental argument for God himself, the ultimate category? This is what the Thomists and the natural theologians and the classical this is what they don't seem to understand, is that the categories that you're appealing to, causation, teleology, the self, time determination, the external world, identity over time, all those transcendental categories, they're also not theory neutral. They don't exist outside of a paradigm. They don't exist in a vacuum. Fazer even says they all hang together, right? When he discusses different kinds of mathematical objects in his chapter on math and numbers, universals, laws of logic, he says those all operate together as a synthesis. Well, if that's the case, then that's true also of the other transcendental categories that you appealed to. And if they all work and hang together, then they don't work as in a vacuum outside of some system or paradigm from which they're situated or grounded. And that's what they're not seeming to get, right? Is that there's a difference between using an argument, making an argument, using an argument, what I put in my argument, right? The order, what type of thing I pick to make an argument, that's different from whether in my worldview or in my system, I'm giving that epistemic or ontological priority. So this is a category mistake. And the big category mistake that Thomists make that they don't understand is that they will think that logical ordering or temporal ordering makes something have epistemic priority or metaphysical priority, right? if I begin my reasoning with sense data, then sense data must have epistemic and metaphysical priority. No, that does not follow. And especially doesn't follow when we're asking for how to justify the belief in those things. And that's the big thing that they can't do by necessity, because just like the skeptics, they box themselves in. Just like the materialists, they box themselves in. To what? To saying that all knowledge comes from sense data. That's Aristotle's basic dictum in posterior analytics and in metaphysics, right? This isn't even controversial. But how silly, right? To start our paradigm or worldview in something that we think is a self-evident maxim, that all knowledge comes from sense data, and then try to build up a system, stack on top of that a system of seeing in the natural world teleology and causation from sense data. I mean, have any of these people read a single modern book, the Bonjour book on epistemology? They would immediately be presented with about 5 major problems that can't be answered with that starting point under determination of data, right? How do you know that the thought corresponds to the object? And you could say, well, if we don't say that, then it falls apart. Yeah, exactly. That's a transcendental argument. Yeah, exactly. If you look at what I said to Stefan, right, in the Stefan Molyneux debate, I brought up all of these major problems that, guess what? They're the same for the skeptic as they are for the Thomist, right? Now, that might sound a little weird, but what? But they have different views, right? Of course they have different views, but I'm not critiquing their different views, and I'm not saying that they don't have some things right as Thomists.
Or so.
So if you go back to the Stefan debate, I listed several things for any empiricist position, right, that are problematic, that they cannot resolve. And remember, right, Thomism is an empiricist position. It's not empiricism, right? That's a different school. That's Locke, Berkeley, Hume, right? But the methodology of Thomism, like Aristotle, begins its epistemology and its system with sense data. And it makes the mistake, the category mistake, of thinking that because I start there from human perception, temporally or logically, that therefore that starting point must have epistemic priority, some higher level of certitude, or some metaphysical priority. And it doesn't, right? I could pick anything to make an argument or to start an argument, right? I could argue about pencils. I could say, here's a pencil, here's a pen. I'm going to argue for God's existence using tag, right, from a pen. Does starting my argument with pen mean that pens have epistemic priority and metaphysical priority? Well, we all know pens are just more certain than everything else, right? I mean, pens are just self-evident, right? Because we all use pens. That's literally the level that these people use to try to justify the categories that they start with. Literally, so in Fazer's book, why does he say we should believe things like the principle of sufficient reason or causation? He says because they're commonly accepted. They're generally accepted. What? That's almost as bad as Matt's argument. Why should I believe in values for beings? Because the ancestors accepted it, that beings have value. Okay, that's not a justification. Okay, that is a bad argument. That's a circular argument. And guess what? Thomists don't do circular arguments ever at any level. So once they start admitting that they will do for self-evident maxims, for their classical foundational maxims, self-evident so-called truths, once they start admitting that there's a circularity, now they've surrendered their system. Now they've surrendered foundationalism. They're not foundationalists anymore. Right? Once you start admitting transcendental arguments, right, for transcendental categories, if you're a Thomist, you've moved out of the realm of foundationalism. Now you're admitting circular arguments. And oh, wait a minute, I thought you were opposed to all forms of circularity. But what you see, the point here is that at a worldview level, circular arguments are unavoidable. And what did I say to Stefan? I'm going to blow you away, right? Everything that I said to Stefan in the debate is the exact same critique and thing I would say to the Thomist. Why? Because even though they have radically different conclusions about the world and God's existence, I know that. I know that Thomists affirm God, they affirm Christianity. I know that. What I'm critiquing is the invalid moves that they use to get there. What does every empiricist philosopher, right? Empirical philosopher, that is, any philosopher who begins his system with the presupposition, the starting point that all knowledge comes through sense data. That is the peripatetic axiom. That is Aquinas' view. And ultimately, that's the Roman Catholic view. That's why they make these arguments. There's the myth of the given, that objects just have a givenness, right? When you see an object, it's just immediately presented to you what the meaning of that object is, right? And that you're able to pick out that object in an array of objects. There's the problem of the external world. Sense data does not tell you that there is an external world. Sense data does not tell you that all knowledge comes through sense data. What's the peripatetic axiom? All knowledge that's in the intellect is first in the senses. Does sense data tell you that the peripatetic axiom is true? No, then it's self-refuting. There's the status of immaterial objects. There's the fact that there's no properly basic beliefs. There's the underdetermination of data. These are just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 serious problems, right? For any foundationalist system of epistemology, and that's what Aquinas and Thomism is. So again, remember, the critiques are the same. I know they're different systems, and it doesn't matter because Stefan's starting point is the exact same as the Thomist starting point. All right, that was a long rant, but I forgot what we were even doing here. Let's get back to this.
I'm in love with a heartbeat. I don't think you're trying to stop it. But do you leave a piece of it? 'Cause I'm in love with a thought. Oh, I'm on elf feels. Feeling all your feels. Crying little man tears. Crying goes on. Oh.